was pretty good after coming back from World War II. George Bush goes to Yale University, family alma mater, is in an accelerated program for veterans who had just come back. Graduates Phi Beta Kappa, joins Skull and Bones, the legendary secret society of influential folk, and has great adventures as the captain of the baseball team, such as meeting Babe Ruth, of all people. And of course, perhaps most importantly, has another George show up, George W. Bush, who was born on the Yale campus. In fact, interestingly enough, at the time, the Bushes were living in an apartment complex. I mentioned this is after World War II, so housing is really tight. They were living in an apartment complex that happened to be next door to the university president's house. So you can imagine it's a pretty nice street. In fact, that's the street where I used to work on when I used to teach there on that campus. And the university president at one point knocked on Barbara Bush's door. Keep in mind, she's about 20 years old at this point, and says, "Would you mind not hanging out the diapers to dry when I'm having a dinner party in the backyard?" So, and again, those are our future president's diapers. Small worlds. They have another daughter, the Bushes, Robin, and then move out to West Texas in order for George to start a career in the oil fields. Now, this part turns sad, of course, because Robin, just go back to her. Robin, unfortunately, passes away at a very young age, the age of 3, from leukemia. She's actually buried next to her parents now in College Station at the Presidential Library gravesite. This was a tragic loss for George Bush, obviously. He writes in his diary and his letters about the pain that, again, never goes away. It's also a searing moment for George W. Bush and for Barbara Bush. In a sense, really brings the two of them together. George W. Bush, I'm probably not going to mention him much the rest of the time, but it's worth this anecdote here. Always said that he had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth. Barbara Bush was uninhibited, shall we say, in some of her use of language. George W. Bush the same way, and he talked about in his life that he remembers his mother's depression during this time, though being only a young lad, only 6 or 7 years old, didn't appreciate what depression was, but he knew he had to hang out near her and hang out with her and try to keep her cheery. And in a sense, they fused a bond while George H.W. Bush was off dealing with the grief of losing his daughter, yes, but off pursuing his business career. He was on the road a lot during George W.'s childhood. He becomes a very successful businessman and then begins an extraordinary arc of progress through the American political system, entirely through the Republican Party. Remember, his father had been a senator in the Republican Party. These are the traditional Northeast liberal Republicans, liberal on social issues. His father, for example, was referred to as Rubbers Bush. Why? Because that one of his big issues was to support Planned Parenthood, which was quite scandalous at the time. In fact, Connecticut did not allow contraceptives for much of George Bush's life. Just gives you a sense of how time has changed. They allow them now, in case you're wondering. And more importantly, Bush was part of a renovation, a revitalization, an infusion of new blood and energy into the Southern aspect of the Republican Party. Remember, the Democratic Party controls the South basically from the Civil War up until the late 60s, early 70s, when the Civil Rights Movement, and in particular, Lyndon Johnson's decision to support the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, completely upend the entire snow globe, if you will, of American politics and put the South back into play for Republicans. And that's a whole nother lecture. But what you need to know about George H.W. Bush going forward is that he's in Texas at this time as a dyed-in-the-wool Republican and is a fervent party builder. He winds up taking a job after his family moves to Houston. The oil business he was in began to focus increasingly on offshore production. So Houston was a smarter move geographically than Odessa. And consequently, he becomes a party organizer in Harris County outside of Houston, which turns Republican. Essentially, it was purple turning red, and then begins a remarkable career. He becomes a Senate candidate, doesn't win, but actually Lloyd Bentsen, who future vice presidential candidate for Mike Dukakis, is the one who beats him. And again, this gives us an insight into Texas politics at the time, because George Bush ran as the Republican and Lloyd Bentsen ran as the Democrat. in 1964, and Lloyd Bentsen was able to claim the mantle of being the conservative. Texans like to vote for conservatives, so Bentsen wins the position. Also, it didn't hurt that he was running on the same ticket as Lyndon Johnson in 1964 during one of the greatest political landslides in American history. So George Bush comes back, runs for Congress from Harris County, outside of Houston, wins several times as a congressperson, decides he's going to run again for the Senate with the encouragement of President Richard Nixon. He had become quite close to Nixon as an advisor to Nixon at this time when he was in the Congress, Bush. And Nixon says, well, if you run for the Senate and you don't make it, we'll take care of you. Well, he didn't make it. So they took care of him. They gave him a really cushy job, not a cushy job, fascinating job, important job, critical job from Bush's perspective. They named him United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, now, wait a minute. Hold on, Professor. So far, you've told us that this guy was a pilot. Sure, that's an international experience during war. But he also was a business person based primarily in West Texas. What exactly is his qualification for being the ambassador to United Nations? That was actually his qualification, was that he wasn't qualified. In fact, George Bush was very clear about this. He wrote to Henry Kissinger, Secretary of National Security Advisor at the time, and also to the president, and also to President Nixon's chief of staff, and said, let me be clear, I don't know anything about foreign policy, which means you can trust me to do what you say. I'm not going to be up there in New York undermining you. I'm not going to be up there trying to maneuver around your back. I don't know how to do that. I will be the ultimate yes man for you in the United Nations. And frankly, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon liked that idea. They also liked the idea that George Bush had, of course, a lot of connections back to the New York financial community. So they name him ambassador to the United Nations. And this explodes Bush's worldview. In a sense, it's the moment in his life where he comes into himself. Amazingly enough, after so many decades of being on the earth, he begins to appreciate how much of a passion he has for international affairs and how much he seems to intuitively understand that international affairs are run by people. May not seem too obvious a point, but it's not oftentimes remembered by diplomats, especially American diplomats during this period, during formerly the height of the Cold War, at least the height of American power during the Cold War. And then, of course, the 1970s, a period of transition where American power appears to waver throughout the world. But many diplomats, especially George Bush's predecessor at the United Nations, advised him that he should stay in his office. Why? Because other countries' delegates should come visit you. You are the representative of the United States. You are representing the most powerful government in the entire history of the world. They should come to you to show proper respect. George Bush didn't see it that way. He actually ruffled a whole lot of feathers and startled a whole lot of secretaries when he would just walk around the United Nations and pop into different people's offices just to say hi. He really conducted diplomacy like a business person. That is to say, he wanted to develop personal relationships. And as he put it one time to me during one of the interviews that we did, he said, listen, the sovereignty to the people of Burundi is just as important as the sovereignty is to the people of the United States. So we have to assume that everybody cares first and foremost about their country and treat them with respect. And that's essentially what he did as an unusual path for diplomacy. He loved that job. He would have stayed in that job forever. First of all, it's pretty nice having an apartment paid for by the government on the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations gets. That's not bad. But also, he found the work absolutely fascinating. He was not given that chance. Why? Well, because Richard Nixon, after the re-election, massive landslide re-election of 1972, reorganizes his entire cabinet, reshuffles everything. I'm going to jump ahead a slide to show you what Nixon said. Nixon said that I want to get rid of everybody. Well, except for George Bush, because he'll do anything. So whatever we want, he's loyal. We can put him wherever we really need somebody for the worst job possible. And the worst job possible at that time was to be head of the Republican National Committee. Now, I got to tell you, you're probably in the back of your mind doing the math on this one and saying, wait a minute, this is about to get really bad. Right. It goes from being an unpleasant job to being what George Bush described as the worst job he ever had. He referred to this period as in the center of the storm. He referred to this period as the time when there was a maelstrom of his life. And that maelstrom, of course, was Watergate, which Bush had no role in whatsoever. with the exception of being the Republican National Committee chair when Watergate was going on. So you can imagine every day he had to go out and defend the President of the United States. And numerous times, Bush asked the president if there's anything that he should know about, if there's anything that you're not telling me the truth on. And Nixon said, no, there's nothing. He said that to the nation too. And therefore, when it was discovered just how nefarious and illegal Nixon's activities had been, George Bush was among the group of senior Republicans who went to him in his final days and said, it's time for you to go. And he felt entirely burned by this experience. It's one thing, he said, to go out and make a political argument on behalf of your party when you think it's true. It's another thing to go out and essentially lie to the American people every day, thinking that you're telling the truth. And he didn't like that part at all, and found this to be a difficult time, which is why after Watergate, after Nixon resigns, after George Bush is considered to be one of the vice presidential possibilities for Gerald Ford, chooses Nelson Rockefeller instead. Gerald Ford asks him, well, okay, what would you like basically as your reward for good service to the party? And George Bush says, I'd like to go far away, please. I'd like to go become ambassador to China. Now, why is there an asterisk next to the ambassador for China part? Well, because officially we did not have, the United States did not have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So consequently, George Bush was actually the chief of the U.S. Liaison office to the People's Republic of China. Ambassador in all but name, but you weren't actually able to call him ambassador. But wait, you could, because he had been ambassador to the United Nations. But it's really just some fascinating diplomatic protocol that comes out of this period, perhaps more than you want to know. But just give you one quick anecdote. Because the United States did not officially have diplomatic relations with China, when diplomatic events would occur in China, in which diplomats would be lined up to meet people based upon their rank importance, obviously the most important countries go first. Bush was always at the end of the line, because even the smallest country in the world that we had diplomatic relations with, the Chinese would say, is more important than a country that we had no relations with officially. So everybody knew that George Bush was the representative of the most powerful country in the world. But oftentimes he said that he was seated on the introduction line or seated at a table next to the head of the representative from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, terrorist organization. So you get a sense just of how low he was officially on the totem pole, though he was able to get meetings with most of the Chinese leaders, most often when he wanted, because he was, again, de facto American ambassador.